We are announcing a special business meeting for next Sunday for a quick membership matter. Not sure at this point if it's going to be AM or PM, but I know you'll be here for both, so it doesn't really matter. Last week, I think I asked, what is the only New Testament book named after a Gentile? I was thinking Luke. Jim Van Riper reminded me there's another one, Titus, he was indeed right, is another New Testament book named after a Gentile. What prompted that was Ruth being an Old Testament book being named after a Gentile. So, good job, Jim. I remember when I was a student at Faith Baptist Bible College, the student council each month would run some sort of a social activity. That was especially nice for students who didn't have cars and weren't able to get off campus. But each fall, I think it was in November, the activity, whatever the specifics of the activity were, was always dubbed a Sadie Hawkins activity. And as a freshman, I didn't know what that was, but I learned real quick. What that meant was that only the girl was allowed to ask the guy to go to the activity. And they even spelled it out. The girls weren't allowed to ask well in advance. They actually set a time. It was like 2 weeks before the event, after chapel. Then the girls were allowed to start asking. And I can remember even after that chapel, guys were actually running. Like apparently in the old history of how this Sadie Hawkins began. So there's a Sadie Hawkins night in the Bible, and we have it right here in Ruth chapter 3. If you haven't figured out what it is, I will point it out when we come to it. So we are in Ruth chapter 3. Let me read verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?" In light of how chapter 2 has closed, we can surmise that Naomi has come up with an idea, a hope at least, that maybe Boaz would be interested in her daughter-in-law, Ruth. Now, Boaz has been interested in at least Ruth for caring for her as an outsider and the needs that she had as it related to that. Of course, Naomi was thinking beyond that. Now, why would it be that Boaz wouldn't have pursued her like in a dating relationship, as we would say in our culture? Well, there's a number of reasons that we can surmise. The Bible doesn't tell us. It may be that Ruth was wearing mourner's clothing. She was indicating that she was still in mourning as a widow, and so maybe in light of that, Boaz kind of kept his distance. We'll learn later in this chapter in verse 10 that he assumed that Ruth would marry someone younger, so it really didn't cross his mind that a wedding would even be in the realm of possibility. And of course, we'll learn later in our chapter that Boaz was aware of the fact that he wasn't the closest relative as far as the pecking order of who would be in line to marry. So anyway, it was a tricky task, but Naomi decided that for her daughter-in-law's sake, she needed to get involved. And of course, this is a culture where marriages were arranged, so it wasn't that ridiculous that Naomi would get involved. But how do you go about arranging that? Obviously, Ruth just can't go up to Boaz in the middle of the barley field and get down on one knee and say, "Will you marry me?" There's got to be some way. And you know, I think here in verse 1 of chapter 3, I'm beginning to sense a little bit of an attitude change in Naomi. I don't sense bitterness here. I sense maybe a little bit of hope. And if that's the case, if I'm not reading into that, what would explain Naomi's change? I'm going to guess the consistent testimony of Ruth has had a bearing on that. And maybe just some of the providential things that have happened in a positive way has caught Naomi's attention. And I'm proud of Naomi here that at least according to her words, her sole motivation is the welfare of her daughter-in-law. She's not really expressing concern for her own financial status or for her family line to be continued. It's simply concern for Ruth. And the word here is security. The word security means a place of rest. It speaks of a place of security and tranquility that a woman in Israel would long for and expect to find in the home of a loving husband. Verse 2, Naomi continues, "Now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maids you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight." Now, I don't know how Naomi knew this, but she knew the routine. Maybe she just knew that what happened in the evening at the barley harvest. Winnowing would be what transpires when you would take, we would call it a pitchfork, and you would throw it up into the air, and the wind would blow the chaff, and then the barley would fall to the ground. So that's what would be happening. That's what Boaz would be doing on this particular evening. The men would do that. The evening provided a nice breeze. And then you would typically sleep that night next to the grain because you wanted to protect it from animals and protect it from thieves. You may recall that in the book of Judges, sometimes that happened. You know, these other foreign nations would come in during harvest time and would steal the food. And so the best thing to do would be to sleep right next to the grain, and that's what we anticipate that Boaz would be doing as well. So here is the plan that Naomi has for Ruth, beginning in verse 3. "Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do." She said to her, "All that you say I will do." Now I understand this seems a little peculiar, maybe a little shady, almost immoral. But I remind you of a couple things. Ruth is a virtuous, godly woman. Boaz is a godly man as well. And as the story unfolds, he's going to commend her for being a noble woman. So we can be assured that nothing inappropriate is being suggested here by Naomi. She is suggesting to Ruth that she anoint herself. That basically means in our vernacular, put on some perfume. Remember in those days, they didn't have hot and cold running water. You couldn't easily take a shower. So very often you would anoint yourself with perfumed olive oil. You know, it was a hot climate and you didn't have deodorants and things like that. So that was important. You'll note the word best is actually in italics in the NASB. I did a little bit of work. I'm not so convinced that what Naomi is saying here is put on your best dress to impress a man. The word for clothes simply means an outer garment, a cloak, a mantle, and that's what Naomi is saying she should wear. So it's not necessarily meaning her best clothes. Besides, why put on your nicest dress if it's going to be the middle of the night and you can't be seen anyway? So what is the point of that? Two different suggestions I'll throw out. If you'll turn to Exodus chapter 22. Exodus 22 and verse 25, we read these instructions from the Lord. "If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak," there's our same word, As a pledge, you are to return it to him before the sun sets. So it may be all Naomi is telling Ruth here is, hey, it's going to be the middle of the night. It's going to be really cold, so make sure you wear your heavy cloak, your heavy mantle. That might be what's going on. Or as I hinted at earlier, it may be up to this point Ruth has worn mourner's clothes, and Naomi is instructing her to change out of those once and for all and wear the clothes, indicating that you are now moving on. And what might lend support to that is if you will turn to 2 Samuel chapter 12. Just so you know that I'm not just a wild guess in the dark, there is reason here to suggest maybe it's mourner's clothes that Naomi is saying that stop wearing. 2 Samuel 12:20. And let me give you the context. This is David's infant son who was very ill and then died. And then verse 20. So David arose from the ground. Note what he does. Washed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes. And he came into the house of the Lord and worshiped. So when David did those three things, the same three things that Naomi is telling Ruth to do, it was an indication that mourning is done. mourning. So I'm not sure which of those two is the case here, but one of them certainly must be the case. So instead of bringing Boaz before the public eye, Ruth is going to meet up with him in the middle of the night and ask him to perform the role of a kinsman redeemer. And I'll say a lot more on that in next Sunday night's message. So again, Naomi's scheme, it's bold. And no question, it's unconventional. But I think the Bible's clear that nothing immoral is being suggested or even happened as the events unfold. But there certainly is the potential for disaster. There's a potential that this whole plan could go very wrong. Maybe Boaz, if he's awakened by Ruth, he'll be offended, and here's this lowly Moabite woman, and what does she think she wants? Marry me? Yeah, just so she can get money, climb the social ladder. Maybe he would misinterpret her gesture as something that was inappropriate, that he would take advantage of. Maybe he could charge her with prostitution, or hopefully he would recognize what exactly it was she was asking him to do, and he would respond favorably to her. And in essence, what Naomi is suggesting to Ruth is that she asks for Boaz's hand in marriage. That's what it comes down to. So like I said, the ultimate Sadie Hawkins night. Now in verses 6 through 8, we have the event as it unfolds, and it happens just as it was expected. Boaz awakes from his sleep. We do have the word drunk. It doesn't mean he was drunk with alcohol. It just means he was satisfied. If he was in a drunken stupor, he wouldn't have been able to immediately awake and converse with Ruth. But Boaz shivered, probably because his legs were uncovered on a cool night, and that woke him up. And he was surprised to find someone at the foot of the area where he was sleeping. Verse 9, he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative." Then he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. Now it is true, I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you as the Lord lives. lie down until morning. I'm so tempted to run in the direction of what is this all about, a kinsman redeemer, but again, we'll have to wait until next week for that. So in verse 9, Ruth is requesting Boaz to take her under his wing and assume responsibility for her security as her kinsman redeemer. What Ruth is actually doing is challenging him to be the answer to his own invocation of blessing upon her. Do you remember that? Look at chapter 2 and verse 12. Here's what Boaz said to Ruth earlier. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Wow, pretty bold. And Ruth is saying to Boaz, yes, may that come true, that blessing, and may you be the one that the Lord uses to fulfill that. Rather interesting. Here's a servant making a request of the boss. Here's a Moabite making a request of an Israelite. Here's a woman making a request of a man. Here's a poor person making a request of a rich person. Indeed, a very risky scheme that Ruth is involved in. From a natural perspective, doomed from the beginning as a hopeless gamble. But remarkably, Boaz interprets this whole event as a proposition for marriage, and he accepts, does he not? But he does have this one hesitation, and he does indicate that there is a closer relative who would have first dibs on marrying her, and that is a matter that needed to be settled. Now, what happens from here? Verse 14. So she lay at his feet until morning and rose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Again he said, give me the cloak that is on you and hold it. So she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. So Boaz was in a tricky situation. He didn't want to just send Ruth back home in the middle of the night, and he thought maybe escorting her wouldn't look good, so he said, all right, I guess the best thing for now just to sleep down there at the end of the area, and then early in the morning you can head home before people are out and about. And that is what happened. Now, how did it all end up? Verse 16. Here are the results. When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did it go, my daughter? I wonder if Naomi even slept that night. And she told her all that the man had done for her. She said, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said, do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then she said, meaning Naomi, wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest until he has settled it today. Now, this may be stretching it a little bit, but it's almost as if Boaz here is giving an engagement ring to his future mother-in-law, promising her, I'm going to take, if this works out, I'm going to take good care of you, as well as demonstrated by all this barley I'm sending your way once again. That's a reminder, when you marry a family, do you not? And so you get the family along with the spouse, and Boaz recognizes that, and he is willing to certainly accept that. And it sounds like Naomi here has a note of confidence now in the hidden hand of God that this is going to work out. Part of that may be just simply she knew her relative Boaz, and knew that he was a man who didn't let grass grow under his feet. He would take matters and deal with them without letting time lapse. Now, before I finished my Ruth series, I wanted to make sure at some point I spent a little bit of time on the character of Ruth. And so that's how I want to conclude tonight, on the back of your outline. And as I gathered information, it almost morphed into an entire message in and of itself. And I considered, well, maybe sometime down the road doing a biographical sermon on Ruth, but I'm choosing to share on the back of your outline something that I'll admit I just wanted it to be a subpoint, so as far as a message goes, it's half-baked. So I'll just throw the information your way, and maybe some of you, ladies in particular, might want to take this and really run with it. But I want to draw your attention to chapter 3, verse 11, these words of Boaz, where Boaz says, "Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." Did you know that is the same exact Hebrew word that describes the Proverbs 31 woman? I stumbled onto that many years ago when I was studying Proverbs 31, and I've still had in my file this idea, you've got to do a message on Ruth someday, seeing how many traits from Proverbs 31 you can find in the person of Ruth in her story. So technically, I really haven't done that tonight. I'm just going to go through a number of verses here and just share some things, but there will be a lot of connection with Proverbs 31. You'll see I give you some of the different translations and how they translate that Hebrew word, a woman of excellence, a virtuous woman, a woman of noble character, a worthy woman. And you'll recall the Proverbs 31 woman talks about a lot of things. She was very industrious. She was involved in real estate. And she was a sewer, and she stayed up late. And that's really not so much the point with this word here. The point is godly strength of character when we talk about a virtuous or an excellent or a worthy woman. By the way, Ruth is the only woman, as far as I'm aware of, that this word is specifically used to describe and name. Now, I think there are many women in the Bible who fit that description, but only Ruth happens to be the one where that exact word is used. And I was reminded of something that I had forgotten about, that our Hebrew, I don't know how many of you have Hebrew Bibles, but if you had a Hebrew Old Testament, you realize the order is different. It's not Genesis through Malachi as we have it. In the Hebrew Old Testament, the book of Ruth comes immediately after Proverbs. How fascinating is that? That the Jewish people would read of the Proverbs 31 woman, and they immediately then begin to read of a flesh and blood example of a Proverbs 31 woman as they read about Ruth, who, of all things, was a Gentile, a Moabite. So that's a fascinating study as far as the parallels go. The Proverbs 31 woman, of course, is hardworking, trustworthy, selfless, dedicated to her family, strong, hopeful, dignified, and above all, fears God. And that's Ruth. That is Ruth to a T. Now note this. I find it fascinating some of the contrasts, though, between the Proverbs 31 woman and Ruth. With apologies to you single women or single women who were single, when you heard messages on Proverbs 31 women, the Proverbs 31 woman, it might be that sometimes we preachers have erred in conveying that the Proverbs 31 woman, part and parcel of that has to be being married and having kids. Now, it is true the Proverbs 31 woman was married and had kids, but I want you to note, Ruth, who is called the Proverbs 31 woman, was neither married nor had kids. So that's not really a part of the equation to being a woman of excellence. Now, if you are married and if you do have kids, then that plays into the equation as far as some of the responsibilities that you would have. The Proverbs 31 woman, as you recall, was a wealthy woman. We know that because she had servants, she purchased a field, she helped the poor, she was clothed in expensive clothing. Ruth, however, was at the bottom of the rung of the social ladder. And so again, your wealth status has no bearing on whether or not you are able to be a Proverbs 31 woman. Okay, so you see I have a bunch of references there. Let me just breeze through those. And I challenge somebody, take these and develop them and come up with a nice outline and main points and subpoints on the person of Ruth. So note chapter 1 and verse 16, these very first words out of Ruth's mouth, where she says, "For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." I suspect Ruth understood that in taking this position and conviction may mean that she's going to remain a widow. She may remain destitute for the rest of her life, but it didn't matter. I could only wish more people today had this fierce loyalty and devotion to the Lord like Ruth had, for walking with the Lord and his people. Verse 17, "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Very clear, Ruth is no wishy-washy kind of person. She was a woman of conviction, strong conviction. How about chapter 2, verse 2? Remember, she asked for permission to go glean. "Please let me go to the field and glean." And so I see here a respect of elders. She treats Naomi as an authority figure, even though Naomi is actually dependent upon Ruth. And I think that is admirable. Verse 6, the servant in charge of the reapers replied, "She is a young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." Ruth has just been in Bethlehem a short time, and she's got a wonderful reputation. Her reputation is spread like wildfire. You know, reputation, you can't put a price tag on that according to the book of Proverbs. Verse 7 of chapter 2, when she shows up in the field, she says to the foreman, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers." So here she is, once again, being courteous, asking permission. She's not a presumptuous woman. And then the worker explains to Boaz, she came and she's remained from the morning until now and has been sitting in the house just for a little while. And she worked the entire day. So she is a hard worker. I recall that from the Proverbs 31 woman as well. Very industrious. Verse 11. Boaz says, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know." Again, her reputation, and her reputation impacted other people's lives. And again, the book of Proverbs talks about that, the importance of a reputation because of the impact that it has. It's just been a few short weeks earlier. And of course, she was that Moabite widow, that poor Moabite widow. And now, what a reputation. And how did she achieve this status? Well, it must have been by she just announced to everybody her qualifications and how wonderful she was and how hard. No, she didn't do that, did she? She just set out to be a servant, to be a hard worker, and everybody else could understand what she was really like, having made herself Naomi's servant and working without complaint in the heat of harvest, so her mother-in-law and she would be able to live. Verse 12, "May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." So I think we have more information here that helps us to fill in the picture going back to chapter 1 and verse 16. Ruth was making a commitment to the God of Israel. That is going to be her God, and she has forsaken the gods of Moab, and she did it at personal sacrifice in order to do that. Reminds me of Joshua's words, "Choose you this day whom you will serve." And Ruth made that choice. She abandoned her gods of Moab and chose the true and living God. Verse 17, another verse on her being a hard worker. Verse 19 of chapter 2, I see Naomi perking up for the first time. A big difference between Naomi and Ruth here. Ruth was positive. Ruth was trusting God even in the tough times. Ruth didn't have a poor me, woe is me kind of attitude, and God honors that. Naomi comes to her senses, and I believe Naomi comes to her senses in large part because of the influence of Ruth upon her life, emphasizing the great value of our reputation and our testimony. Chapter 3 and verse 5, once again, Ruth conveying submission and obedience to those who are over her. Verse 6 and following, Ruth does, even though it was a peculiar thing that Naomi asked her to do, Ruth actually did it, and Ruth kept her word. And then in chapter 3, verse 18, Naomi says, okay, Ruth, you've done what I asked you to do. Now, wait. And that's what Ruth did. Ruth was not a manipulator. Ruth didn't get... I'm confident that if it had taken Boaz a week before he got around to it, Ruth wouldn't have gotten uptight and felt, well, I got to do something. I got to manipulate. I got to make this situation happen. There's something. No, she was content. She did what she could do and left it in God's hands. And chapter 4, verse 15, as the book closes, godly character that Ruth possessed to the point where the whole town is singing her praises. A town of Jewish people singing the praises of this Moabite woman. And by the way, I'm reminded of the gate, Proverbs 31:31. Give her the product of her hands and let her works praise her in the gates. And there's a connection. That's exactly what happened with Ruth at the gate. Praise because of how she loved Naomi, how she worked hard to provide food for her mother-in-law and sought to honor her. What a testimony Ruth provides for all of us, whether we're male or female. A motivator to become a person of character, and that our greatest devotion in life is to serve the God of the Bible. So that concludes chapter 3. We might call it Act 3. There's one more act in this exciting play, and we will cover that next week. So far, all the players have played and fulfilled their roles perfectly. Naomi took the initiative to get the ball rolling, and then Ruth carried out this delicate and daring scheme, and Boaz, we breathe a sigh of relief. He responded right on cue, doing what we wanted him to do, and now we have to wait and see how the drama is going to play itself out. Now, before we conclude with a song, one more set of slides from chapter 3 that we covered just tonight. So here's what it would look like when they would be winnowing barley. You'd be in big trouble if you had hay fever, I think. They didn't have masks. I'm sure they must have worn something over their mouths. But imagine the beating of the grain, and then the winnowing means you're throwing it up in the air to let the wind take it. Here's another picture. Peasant winnowing grain at a threshing floor. I think Naomi used that word to Ruth. You're going to meet up with Boaz at the threshing floor. That's where he'll be tonight. Here's some of the farm tools that they would have used, similar in Bible times. And here we have a depiction of reaping, threshing, and winnowing wheat. So this was something very, very common in Bible times, obviously, to be able to eat. Here's a threshing floor with a sledge. Now that word didn't show up in the book of Ruth, but a sledge would commonly have been used, pulled by an animal to kind of separate the grain from the stalk there. That's what would... Another threshing floor with some of the tools that would have been used. Here's some jugs from 1100 BC. And that goes back That's more the time of David, so not quite as far back as Ruth, but I'm sure not a whole lot unlike what Ruth might have drunk water from. Another threshing floor and the work that's being done and the harvest. Shepherds at night in Bethlehem. Throw that one in, what it might have been like. That immediately reminded me, PCS faculty went last December down southern Jersey to a church that had an outdoor living nativity, and they had a shepherd scene. Reminded me of that. Maybe that's what Boaz could have looked like. And here's a reenactment of Boaz giving Ruth the grain, a whole lot of grain. Here's barley and wheat and the loaves of bread that are made from those respective grains. When Ruth first started, it was the barley harvest, and that then led right into the wheat harvest. So Ruth was gleaning for a number of months, and that's why Naomi was getting a little antsy that Boaz wasn't taking any sort of romantic interest, but he was caring for her as a father, at least. And once again, we got a rare picture from Ruth's day of her carrying the grain that Boaz gave her. And this might have what it looked like in the home of Ruth and Naomi. Very, very crude by standards of today. All right, I forget what our final hymn is. Do I have it written down? It is 196. We have to end with a hymn that speaks of Bethlehem. So 196, Once in Royal David's City. Not only where the Christmas story took place, but our story from the book of Ruth.
Let's stand as we sing 196.